Hello, my name is Dietmar Pichler, and this is the Disinfo Resilience Network podcast, which is actually a video cast. And you see us on our YouTube channel. Today, I have a special guest here, a person that I met a lot of times in 2022 when he used to live in Vienna. He's Ukrainian, he's an analytic, yeah, and he knows everything about influence campaigns, disinformation, a lot of cyber analytics, a lot of social media. I will ask him about the old school stuff. Maybe he can learn a couple of things from me. What was the offline world? But please, Artur, first of all, because I never called you by your last name, yeah, Koldomasov, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Koldomasov.
Yeah, okay, I tried my best. This is always a challenge when you know people casual from the beginning, then you don't have the practice in pronouncing their last names. So please introduce yourself better than I could do it.
First of all, thanks for having me. My name is Artur, as you could already hear. Currently, I work as the disinformation analyst for one of the most prominent Ukrainian NGOs in the field called Detector Media, which is considered to be the main Ukrainian media watchdog. I also have a
The
master's
first
degree in
interruption
journalism.
already. Could you explain our listeners? I mean, already know it. What is a watchdog? This is a quite new word for the, let's say, 30, 40 plus generation. What is a watchdog in regarding media monitoring?
That's a really good question, actually, because when we go specifically to that context and when we dissect which NGOs are watchdogs, in that case, media watchdogs, we mean that they mostly follow any changes or any tendencies in media regulation, in media market, in media space and landscape, not only of Ukraine in that case, but also in other countries. For example, for this organization, I'm doing from time to time not only the disinformation research, but also I'm writing some analytical and journalistic articles, for example, related to public broadcasting tendencies or some similar situation. Like the spectrum is very wide because I don't like limit myself in one frame. But my main activity for this media outlet, because at the same time it is the media outlet which has its main online platform and at the same time some other sub media platforms, sub online platforms. My main activity there is definitely disinformation research, specifically related to Russian disinformation abroad, outside of Ukraine, specifically Poland, other European countries, and North America, and also. From time to time, I like to research different tendencies in propaganda related to pop culture and how Russian regime is utilizing the Russian pop culture for the sake of propaganda. Also, I do some research related to Russian propaganda in Moldova, specifically targeted towards Gagauzia and Transnistria, which is also kind of interesting. Despite that, I also have some other projects related to the topic because I have a master's degree in journalism and public communication from the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin in Poland. My previous master thesis was basically a research about the image of US media policy on Breitbart website, which is one of the biggest conspiracy news sort of web platform that became the leading platform for QAnon followers from all across the globe at some point. And starting from that, I also do some research on conspiracy theories and propaganda for Detector Media, also specifically for those conspiracy theories used by Russian propaganda against Ukraine. And as a final line in that introduction, I hope people are not bored with that. Currently, I'm also the student of advanced master's program in European Interdisciplinary Affairs with a focus on European neighborhood at the College of Europe and Natolin. And my research, my master thesis this time will be about the impact of conspiracy theories on Ukrainian EU and NATO integration. And 1 month, I mean, in August last year, I've launched the Alliance 24/08, which is the alliance of different NGOs, organizations, and individuals who are working on the advocacy for the Ukrainian cause in Poland. And we also have some projects related to disinformation. Um, that's the long story short, but I'll be glad to answer more questions about my background. Those people who watch that can reach out to me everywhere they want. I'm pretty available. I might not respond very quickly due to my workload, but I will respond anyways.
Okay, I want
So
to
my
go
DMs
back
are open.
to the watchdog topic, because media watchdog, yeah, and I think, if I remember that correctly, and also what I collaborated with NGOs in Ukraine, also in other countries like Poland and the Baltic states, they when they say media watchdog, they mean what they say. So it's not only social media and not only web based alternative, we call them alternative websites, alternative media, but it's also so-called mainstream media, mass media, and I have a big problem. I think in the West, we have a kind of arrogance that we think that everything that is not super tabloid, which is not so-called alternative media or social media, is somehow invincible to criticism. So if we find something, if there is some Russian narrative in this so-called quality press, then it's always the mistake of the person who criticizes. And it doesn't matter if these people are Ukrainians or if they are, for instance, Austrians or Germans. The powerful media says no. Uh, this person needs to be here. We need to have all this opinion. But if it's about social media, for some reason they don't have this false balance approach. Yeah, that they say every opinion has to be represented. Nah? And this is why I like to collaborate with the Ukrainians because they see it very clearly what is going on here. And I have to say, there are millions of, no, not millions, but thousands of very good journalists in the West, of course. So I don't want to generalize, but the media companies and all this competition and this idea that there needs to be a neutrality towards reality and this false balance reporting, we have it a lot, especially in the German speaking world, but also somewhere else. So I will. This is why I want to ask you again. When you say watchdog and media monitoring, you mean all of it?
Yes, and in the case of Detector Media specifically, they have a long-standing reputation, actually. They launched, I think, somewhere in the 90s, at the very verge of 90s and 2000s. And they started their activity mainly from the traditional media. They started their activity from the media critique, from,
Yeah,
as
great.
I remember, the TV programming critique. And I'm talking about that because when I was a teen, I was reading their op-eds, their researches, their texts, and that's a very big part of the reason why I got that spark of interest in media and in media research back in my day. So when I got basically hired by them to do the research, it was like the full circle moment and the whole story for me. And it's such a pleasure to work with them generally because they're really open to different ideas and different products that they could make in terms of the media research, and they really follow both traditional and new media. So I really appreciate their approach in that, especially in the context of something that you mentioned, which is a whole another complex issue, which is the tabloidization of even traditional media, which is the global trend at that point. And also it's even more important in the context of something else that you've said, meaning that journalists themselves as people are very condescending most of the time, and they are creating this very like closed elite club, very kind of snobbish club where journalists are always right and journalists know everything. And social media, so-called journalists know nothing. So this divide is kind of imaginary, but it really happens everywhere. And this is a very interesting tendency to look at because I think that our generation perceives media differently. And it'll be really curious to see that dynamic in the future, for example, between us and future generations, because they consume media in a much different way than we do. So that's a really interesting nuance, and there are many layers to that because the media culture is different in different countries. So my Eastern European perspective is really, I would say, unique in that context because I could not call my tradition of media consumption pretty traditional and conventional according to Ukrainian metrics, but it's definitely um, more complex comparing to the media consumption tendencies in Austria, for example.
I wanted to ask you um, regarding the media, speaking about mass media and high reach media, you are very much welcomed by the media because I see almost every week I see that you're in TV. Yeah? So can you give us a little bit of overview when these channels call you to give your experts opinion? What do they specifically ask you? What kind of topics do they want to have covered by you, or what kind of opinions they ask? So can you give us a couple of examples if you can recall them spontaneously?
That's a really interesting question and a nice opportunity to comment on the whole state of things, in my opinion, because the situation is pretty interesting, I might say. Because, for example, tomorrow I will have a TV commentary moment on the Ukraine's public TV channel, public broadcasting. Yesterday, no, actually not yesterday. Today, I had one on Prямий, which is like one of the Ukrainian informational TV channels. And it's not officially, but it's under the influence of one of the ex-presidents of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, which is kind of interesting. And it's always feeling like a minefield to agree for such commentaries and to do that. I've never specifically looked for some kind of fame or something like that. I never wanted to be that so-called talking head for people. But I perceived that as a duty starting from 2020, I think. And I take this not too seriously in terms of approach, but I take this seriously in terms of the duty itself. Like, I want to be honest with people. I want to tell them what I think to the extent where it's useful. Because sometimes, I mean, the main principle for me in that regard is very similar to the doctor's one, which is not to harm the informational landscape, the situation in the country, people's minds. I don't. I mean, sometimes my expert opinion is different from my personal opinion. And when I say this, sometimes people are wondering, like, why this is crazy. But actually, I think it's meant to be this way because you should base your expert opinion on facts, on tendencies, or on other different factors and not on your personal view most of the time. And if people ask for my personal view, I give them this, and sometimes they do, and sometimes this opinion is different from something that I present as my expert opinion. The scope of topics that I mostly cover for them is the US politics because from 2019 till 2022, I worked as well, if we specifically speak of from 2020 till 2022, in that capacity, I worked at a think tank called Adestra as the expert in US politics, doing research on different matters related to that field. And also a bit earlier, I've launched my career there from the position of expert in international information first and then informational policy back then. And for example, this is the capacity where me and the long-time colleague of mine, Anastasia Hatsenko, we made a research related to the new version of the Ukrainian media law. As far as I remember, we were doing this together because she was also involved in that kind of capacity back in that think tank. And sometimes I also comment on matters related to disinformation. Sometimes I provide additional comments on some research I'm doing. And there were even instances where I gave interviews related to Eurovision Song Contest because sometimes I'm doing research related to that too. So my media presence is pretty diverse, I might say, even though um, it feels a little bit weird at times that some people, number one, think that I'm getting paid for this, which is not true. I've never ever got paid for any of those commentaries. And the second thing is that, you know, some people in the field, they are given the comment to like five, they give comments to 5, 10 channels at least every day. And this is crazy. And for me, it would be really problematic, in my opinion. I would not want something like that because I think I'm really good with my current balance when I have my own life, when I'm studying, I'm working, I'm having my free time, I'm having me time. And when I have some spare time and opportunity, I give this commentary. However, it's not my obligation to do so. I'm doing this whenever I'm available and whenever I want to do that, because sometimes I don't. Sometimes, for example, I'm doing more comprehensive research on the TV channels that invite me, because sometimes they are fishy, and I'm trying to look at their ownership to understand whether I should be there or not. Sometimes I look, for example, at people who are invited besides me. Sometimes I'm asking people who will be with me or before me or after me at the broadcast, because there are some experts in the field who I don't want to appear with in one time slot, in one TV presentation, just for the sake of my principles and just for the sake of my own reputation.
Thank you. I just wanna add something to that because this is extremely important. Of course, there is no perfect environment for an expert to speak, especially if you are from the field of media literacy, disinformation, analysis of information sphere, because there's so much. Yeah, the business backgrounds, the ownerships, the journalists, the correspondents, and there is no media that is perfect, especially for instance in the German speaking world. Every time I'm invited, I could dig and find, okay, this article was also there where I was. Yeah? But what I did is, for instance, I did not give an interview to Chinese state media. This is something I did, that was kind of barrier that I didn't want to cross, a kind of boundary. And I also would not give an interview to RT or to Sputnik, of course. And I find it interesting that they accuse you of getting paid, because usually the people who are constantly invited to RT and Sputnik got paid. There are a lot of people who act like correspondents. It's quite similar, yeah? Like you described, they have a certain expertise, or they're in a certain country, and then they give all the information about this country, of course, with a certain spin. And then they get paid because the Russians or the Chinese want them to, um, whenever they are outside of the interview situation, also to spread certain kind of narratives. But you told me about a recent project that you wanted to talk about, and it was related. This was related to social media, of course, to or social media to a messenger platform, Telegram. Yeah, one very disputed one. I think in Ukraine it's already somehow blocked. What did you witness there in your research? Can you give us an overview? I found it very interesting because you also saw some covert operations, yeah, false flag, um, s- looking like a false flag attempt to divide Ukrainians and Polish people.
I hope it's not too noisy in the feed. If we talk about this particular project, we have to go back to 2023, when I was doing the research about how Russians tried to influence the results of Polish parliamentary elections back then via Telegram. And when we found the network of channels that could be considered as FIMI, foreign influence manipulation initiatives, as far as I remember it correctly. And basically,
Interference.
yes, interference. Thank you. And you could really see that these channels were either admin by Russians or somehow led by Russians
But
due
they
to
pretended to be what? They pretended to be
they
Polish?
pretended to be Polish because they were in Polish language. However, for example, sometimes there were some details that were basically showing that these channels are not actually Polish, or that they don't have native Polish speakers. For example, there were some word collocations that are only relevant to Russian speakers. For example, something that a Polish native speaker would never say, but something that a Russian with some knowledge of Polish would say. Or, for example, in some messages, these Polish channels were mentioning VSU with V, but number one, a Polish person would never write VSU as Armed Forces of Ukraine with V because they have W letter for this sound. And number two, the Polish people of other Telegram channels or other news outlets, they are either calling the Ukrainian armed forces SZU, Siły Zbrojne Ukraine, or AFU, Armed Forces of Ukraine. So VSU is a Russian abbreviation, which is deciphered as Вооруженные силы Украины. So these are the indicators from time to time that these materials are either written by Russians and they're translated, or they were specifically written by Russians without any translation, but just adapted to the Polish language in some level. And basically back then, this research was really, I think, popular in Poland and got reposted a few times. It got cited by like some other
What kind of
fact-checking
messages
organizations.
were prevalent in these channels back then? Can you give us some examples?
Back then, Russia was trying to promote the idea that the far right movements are the best path for Poland politically. It was openly supporting some marginalized Polish political movements, such as Konfederacja. And for example,
And as
it
far
was
as I
promoted.
remember, they are quite fond of Russia. Yeah, they have a
Yeah,
soft
I mean,
approach.
there is some research that is showing that basically some members of Confederacja were either in Kremlin or paid by Kremlin to have some visits there, or were doing some other things related and tied to Russian authorities. Nevertheless, for example, people from Poland will tell you there are no pro-Russian parties in Poland, which is something that I find not 100% true personally, but that's their opinion. Another message that they were trying to show there back then in 2023 is the anti-Ukrainian propaganda, the hate speech against Ukrainians. There were even messages calling to eradicate Ukrainians, to remove them from Poland. There was also the instrumentalization of Volyn tragedy messages and those differences in perception of these historic events. So basically, Russia was additionally fueling the fire of these disputes and adding more controversy to this, trying to make Ukrainians look like ungrateful, uneducated, rude, and all these other things. Also, Russia was promoting really heavily some conspiracy theories specifically crafted and created for this country. For example, the theory that is called Ukropolin, which says that allegedly there's a secret plan for Ukraine and Poland to merge under the protectorate of Germany, which will be governed by Israel. So it's like the whole another universe of things. And for example, like messages related to Ukraine topic or about Ukraine would sometimes have hashtag Ukropolin. And this is the
Yeah, and this
direct
is
reference to this one.
as you explained it, this is something connected to the old fear in Poland towards Germany. Yeah, this kind of mistrust that is still because of World War II, but it's also connected on the other hand to anti-Semitism. Yeah, it's a conspiracy, and of course the Jews, Israel is behind it. So there is everything inside. There's community you can use, yeah, because you know there's a historical aspect, and the other one is this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory aspect. So it's a new classic. Thank you very much for sharing. What do you see now? Is there something similar happening now, and how do these channels? What do uh, they pretend to be something else? Yeah? So, do they pretend to be Polish channels again, or is it like they don't have any names? Or
So when we look at the research that we conducted in 2024, at the end of it, when we were analyzing it for Alliance 24/08, because we've indicated the problem, and we've decided to do something with that, to act. So we've decided to pile up the evidence and case study, to submit it together with a short explanation and policy paper to the Ministry of Justice of Poland and other relevant state bodies that are working with disinformation, and will soon be doing that. But now we are collecting the support from other organizations and other relevant entities to make this appeal even stronger. So something that we've learned through this research is that even in the small scope, in the small timeline that we took 1 month, but we did that on purpose because we took only, I think, 4 Telegram channels with a wide spectrum of a number of subscriptions, starting from a few thousands and ending with, I think, up to 100,000 subscribers. And we wanted to show how massive of the issue that is that you have almost, I don't know, 400 messages related to the topic just in the scope of 1 month, to show that imagine what is happening if we have such a massive scale just in 1 month. The second thing that we wanted to show is that
I
this
have a question.
propaganda,
I have a question.
yes.
When you say, I would like to speak about the narratives. I mean, you highlighted already disinformation, conspiracy theories, the absurdity of this Ukro Poland, I think it was called. Is there also anything? I mean, it's the foreign information manipulation, interference. It's not only blatant disinformation. It's also about um, all the time speaking about something historical, pointing the fingers into the wounds. Is this also happening? Is everything classic fake news in these groups, or is it also again and again and again trying to, I don't know, amplifying problems, for instance, historical problems, historical controversies? Is this also happening, or is it completely focused on disinformation? I mean, manipulation is both, of course, especially when it's covert operations, no doubt. But what can you say about the narratives in these channels?
So that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. Going further into that research, because we've noticed some topical categories, and we've noticed the different spectrum of that disinformation, starting from something very subtle, which could be some manipulated quotes or misinterpreted quotes, or some statements of some marginalized people, or, for example, something that had good intentions but was turned out in a bad light by Russian propaganda. And we had something super extreme, super radical together with that. Like, for example, the messages to kick Ukrainians out, to stop making payments for them, to kick them out from education, to kick them out from the state services. There were also some messages blaming Ukrainians for all the problems in Poland, calling them the main problem that is Poland having currently. There were also some historical messages, as I mentioned earlier, tapping on the wounds and differences of view of Volyn tragedy, for example, and basically disrupting all actions that could be constructive for that mention. For example, some actions that actually had a goal to try to solve the issue were sabotaged by Russians because they were amplified with a very radical view on the issue. So basically, these channels, most of the times, they are pretending to be very radical, very nationalistic, very like caring for Poland. But when you notice these differences that are showing that actually most probably Poles are not involved in that, or involved but to the limited capacity, actually it shows that, I mean, somebody else tries to do something there. And I'm saying about all of that kind of cautiously because the most important part is that these channels are anonymous, meaning that we don't know who the owners are, who are the admins, who are the leaders, how the hierarchy is built there. For example, some of them are tied to some other websites or portals that are considered to be pro-Russian, like, for example, krese.pl, which is that super radicalized anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian news outlet that has been considered as such by a number of different fact-checking and investigative organizations in Poland. So we've noticed all these patterns. I mean, the most ridiculous example that would tell you how subtle and at the same time different this disinformation can be is, for example, that there in one of the Polish cities, the chain restaurant coming from Ukraine called Rebernia has been opened. So it's basically serving the barbecue style dishes and etc. for those who are not in the context. And basically, Russian propagandists on this Polish language Telegram channels, they wrote something like, oh, they're opening that new restaurant and they are like frying ribs on the blood of our like relatives. They killed our relatives in the Volyn tragedy, and now they are like serving us this meat. How what a blasphemy it is. You are like dancing on the graves with that, and how Polish authorities allow something like that to happen. Like it's
Yeah, so
manipulation on the worst
basically
topic.
you've
So
heard how extreme it can be, but also it can be very subtle. Like for example, with messages about saying that we want a better Poland. No politicians are good enough. We need to look for some alternatives. We need to look for people who are open to the multipolar world, if that rings a bell for
What is
you.
the
And
multipolar world regarding to them? I mean, I talk a lot about it a lot, and I see this is a very, very common narrative. Also, in far right circles, it used to be a left wing pro-Russian narrative, especially during the Cold War. But it has, I mean, there is a lot going on with this multipolar world and the so-called global South, where they don't speak about people, they don't care about people. It's all about, of course, these leaders and autocrats who are creating this anti-Western alliance. So, what do you see when you monitor those channels when they speak about the multipolar world? What is connected with it?
first of all, when we talk about that, we really have to understand that Russia is really, I mean, it sounds obvious maybe to you, but I think for many people who are not that aware of how Russian disinformation works, Russia now is basically trying to play with all the target audiences and target groups available. So sometimes it might appeal to the far right people, but sometimes it might appeal to the far left people. And some people are still thinking that these divisions work. And for example, they are becoming the part of that trap when they say something like, oh, if they serve only far right, they cannot serve far left at the same time, which is not true because actually Russia is very masterful at doing both and also appealing sometimes to centrists and appealing to other things because Russia cannot catch, unfortunately, as many people in like across the globe, they cannot catch the understanding that actually these divisions don't work anymore because now like the political affiliation is so diverse and it's really dependent on the context and on each particular individual case because
I
the
can, sorry to interrupt, but you triggered one experience that I made just today, just a couple of hours before our
yeah
conversation here. There was an Instagram channel, and this Instagram channel, it is called Liberals to Gulag, yeah, and it's a tanky page. So this is a Marxist, Leninists, radicals, and they are pro-Stalin. They have several Stalin memes. They have a favorable view of Stalin, Mao, and all this stuff. Yeah, they have extremely strong anti-Zionist view and conspiracy theories. Everything is there. And you know what I've witnessed, because, and this is why I remember it, because you say the division, it's not so clear anymore. They have several videos with, for instance, Jeffrey Sachs on their page with statements from Jeffrey Sachs that they support.
yeah
And they are using footage from the interview Jeffrey Sachs with Tucker Carlson. And Tucker Carlson is everything, but he's not a very famous person for the left. He was for the far right or right wing populist. And I see this so many times now, and they don't hide it. And in Austria, we had a political figure who is also in this so called anti imperialist, far left, pro Russian, pro China circles. And he said he admires the far right because they have this very strong pro neutrality view in Austria and in Switzerland. And they work together. And I remember in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, and the Russian covert invasion of Donbass, they already started a little bit to. I mean, if you ask a far left pro-Russian person, and I said, but do you know that the far right is also they say the same, they have the same narratives, and then they said, yeah, sometimes they maybe also be there, you know, not working watch shows the correct time once a day, or some um, reactions like that I received. So, how do you see these people interacting? What is your experience about that, especially in the Western world?
that's such an interesting thing to tap on and the important one because for example even in the institution where I'm currently studying there are some voices that are saying that, well, it's kind of understandable when Russia presents this multipolar world narrative and that, and there are reasons why it's so believable. I mean, there are some flaws in the
Sorry to
Western
interrupt. Where are these
narratives.
people from, or these voices? Are these Polish or Ukrainians, or are they Western voices, Americans, French, Spanish, German, Austrian people? Can you give us some overview without mentioning names, of course?
Yeah, I mean, of course, but I mean, actually, it's a bunch of different countries, starting from the Balkans, finishing with MENA countries, as so called. Like, and of course, there are some Ukrainians in the bunch and some Europeans. I mean, people when they are trying to research international relations and like all of that, they try to put that like super neo-realistic and like cynical lens on things that are happening, but at the same time, it's not working in the contemporary reality anymore. But this is another conversation. Circling back to your question, I think that Polish channels that we are talking about are basically exercising one template that Russia has for all these channels abroad. I'm talking about the Balkan channels, the Baltic channels, the Slovak channels, the Bulgarian channels. Like my Telegram feed is crazy, trust me. And some Moldovan channels also. And all of them are promoting the same idea with sometimes even the same materials, that Russia and China is the way to go. That Russia and China, they protect the international order, and Russia and China protect less powerful countries. And this narrative is like very on the surface, very superficial for the most part, because of course Russia would never export some ideas that go against that view, except if it's targeted against Ukraine or some other countries. But the point is that even when we put the Russian aggression against Ukraine out of the equation, and if we dig deeper into the Russian media space, actually this narrative also falls apart. Because, for example, and this is a good example, which also is related to something what you say, to the interaction between people from different political groups and etc. For example, there is one Russian Telegram channel called Многонационал, which translates as international, but not as an adjective, but as like a noun. And the problem is that this is a channel that is very anti-migrant, but it's very anti-migrant in the Russian context. So it uses framing technique, which is selective reporting of things that are comfortable and that are good for the promotion of narratives and ideas of somebody who is publishing it or somebody who is leading those who publish that. And in that case, you can find only negative materials about migrants from Central Asia there. And this channel is super radical and super racist against migrants from Central Asia, migrants from African countries, migrants from other countries. It's very radical. It has calls to exterminate all those people from Russia. It has open appeals to the Russian government to expel all those people, to execute the mass deportations, similar to something what some other politicians are promoting currently in other countries. It's featured
But
in many
when
different.
if you allow me to say one thing, I see a lot of campaigning, especially by, I don't know, paid influencers, these subtle influencers, Western individuals, who promote the idea, for instance, that there is no racism in Russia, which I found ridiculous because the racism I saw in Russia is incomparable to anything I saw anywhere else, including all countries in Eastern Europe. What I saw there was like in these stereotypical videos about neo-Nazis in the 90s, and I can only imagine what people experience who live there and have a certain background. But still, these influencer content, that, for instance, there is no racism against black people in Russia, that everything is all right, is of course targeting audiences in African countries. But how do you think that we as a community, as debunkers or fact checkers, also fail to communicate, for instance, this channel that you described, because when somebody is spreading the narrative that this doesn't even exist, that there is no racism, that there are no racist people there, this absurd claim, and that it's so much better than in the United States or in France, Germany, or something, or the United Kingdom. How is that possible? I mean, why is there no natural debunking process? I mean, I remember I had a friend from Bucha who traveled to Transnistria because he was a truck driver, and he said the people there, even if they are so close, they believe that Russian narratives, Russian fake information, that, for instance, like that Russian language is banned. Even if they are so close and it's so easy to inform you, every time he had to explain them that it's completely bullshit. So, yeah, what do you think about this racism? Um, lack of information. I think it's worldwide. I mean, how can left wingers support this country that is so much based on racism, nationalism, and also this colonial history towards um, all the peoples in the Central Asian region?
This question taps into one really important thing about the whole fact-checking community. We have a very big moral challenge every time we have a case to debunk or something like that. Like, for example, when we do something for Disinfo Chronicle project, which is directly related to that or something like that. There are some fakes and there are some messages that are crafted to be spread out with debunking efforts. And it takes a really careful consideration and a really careful research intuition, let's call it like that, to detect whether it would be worth it to introduce that to the audience so they would know how this looks like, or to leave that out and not help the propaganda. And for example, this is the approach that we take in Detector Media in most of the instances. When we do the research, we don't specifically name the titles of the Telegram channels we're talking about and their origins. So people would not look for it because Russians really understood that all fact-checking projects have at least one person who is skeptical towards fact-checking, and this person will go to the mentioned channels and will follow it and will fuel the fire. So basically the target is reached. If we talk about this particular topic and this particular notion, I think coming from also my experience of different internships at different institutions, including some diplomatic missions that are working at the OSCE, IAEA, and like other UN agencies that are headquartered in Vienna. So that's why I was in Vienna, as you know. I think that the Western delegations are not doing enough work in that regard because most of the time they are really superficial with their approach to the Russian media landscape. And Russians have a very contrary, a very different approach to the Western media landscape. And when we talk about the fact-checking community, it's one thing. But when we are talking about the diplomatic environment where these issues are needed to be addressed, and when these things should be addressed and they are not, and instead of the substance and something that could enhance the Western position, and especially the Ukrainian one, we are talking about something very superficial, very on the surface. And this is the exact embodiment of the phrase the way to hell is paved with good intentions. Because I understand that these people are trying to have this fact-checking mindset too, not to spread the disinformation around and so on and so forth. However, I'm not talking about disinformation specifically here. Because, for example, when I was still there, I was listening to the Western statements saying just with plain words that, oh, actually, Russia is racist, but they were not providing any examples for that. You could find those examples if you would go to the Russian media, to the Russian media landscape, and so on and so forth. You could find those examples if you would really want to do that. Meanwhile, Russia is literally digging up everything it can to support their message in the Western media. And this could be different research pieces, and this could be really existing opens that were not affiliated with Russian media or Russian positioning whatsoever. They could just take something from the media space and put it to their position, and so it would look more credible. So it would create this illusion of credibility. And I,
When you speak about more credible, I have to think about agents of influence, because the Russians and
yeah,
also the Chinese have a lot of agents of influence, paid or not, or somehow others convinced to spread Russian narratives. And in academia, it's a very huge topic, and it's worldwide, but especially in Western countries, also in the United States. I think this is their gold standard to subvert academics in the United States. And what they do all the time is they push them to go to mainstream media, or um, to have as much footage as possible, and then they spread it via social media, via Telegram, and then it's on TikTok and Instagram. And this is very useful to support their point. I mean, Jeffrey Sachs and the UN, yeah, you remember his speech there. And as far as I remember, the Russians initiated it, or were at least supportive of it.
yeah, yes. So this is the good example of how that works. And the question is that, for example, why these people who could respond to that officially, for example, why they're not talking about the fact that Russian small towns don't have tap water, why they don't talk about the massive corruption that is happening all around Russia. Like, for example, everybody is very nitpicking about corruption in Ukraine. And meanwhile, I mean, if there is an issue, like we cannot ignore that. But in comparison with Russia, it's it's nothing. When you have like the whole state service system built in a way that you could get nothing without a bribe. And the thing is that education is also very much corrupt in Russia. And the most important thing is that while Russia is blaming Ukraine for being too corrupted, it doesn't say that actually Russia brought corruption to Ukraine, that actually Russia promoted the political leaders with the political manager campaign managers with the Russian money to be there and to build that system of governance, that Russia has brought this with the Soviet Union practices during the Soviet Union occupation of Ukraine. So that's the point that we should be discussing, and that's what we should be tapping into. Ukraine and other countries, but specifically Ukraine in that case, have a superpower in that context. They can tell about Russia something true and something what Russia will never tell about it itself. So we have to use it very mindfully, very carefully, but use it because as I tested this during the time where I was in Vienna, this really works. This is not a one-day job. The diplomatic service and international organizations and multilateral diplomacy is, in general, a very time-consuming process. The results there are seen, I don't know, in months, the least. But these steps really really attack the core of the Russian disinformation. They are doing this on such a scale because they already know how others would respond. So if we break that plan and if we present something new to the table, and Russians don't expect actually those other countries to go very deep into their media landscape and find something there. And this is one of the reasons why Russia is trying to secure that concept and to implement that concept of so-called sovereign internet, something that they're playing with for quite a while. That is the notion, and we have to work on that also because if nobody speaks about that, Russia gets the opportunity to craft the very idealized version of itself, which is completely fake. And that's what makes it more difficult to debunk disinformation. And also related to that, and according to like some other practices that I've seen in my short at that time career of disinformation analyst, I think pre-bunking is more effective in many capacities than debunking because I think people, number one, people they got used to debunking pretty quickly, which is rather a negative thing there because just miss, they just scroll down the debunking efforts. And I mean, taking into account the current pace and speed of our media consumption, our news consumption, if this debunking effort is not very fast, if it's not even immediate in many cases, this fails. Like, if it's debunked, like if it should be efficient, it should be made immediately most of the time. And this is the big
I
issue.
agree. I agree with you on a certain extent, but there are examples where disinformation pieces have such a long lifespan, and I will give you one, which I hear since more than 10 years that the Americans paid 5 billions for Euromaidan, for the Euromaidan revolution. So for our listeners, I think 99% will already know that it's fake, but I just, to get sure, I will repeat. Of course, the Americans did not pay 5 billions for Euromaidan. This Victoria Nuland quote is about 5 billions of US aid since 1991, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it was development money and is absolutely not connected to any kind of protests. And there are a couple of fact checks online, and I use them since 10 years. And every time somebody is spreading that lie, I debunk it, I explain it, and then I have my sources and my links. And I think it's very useful because at least they start thinking after that. But I absolutely agree, and I understand in many cases, especially if it's something that doesn't matter next week anymore, then the fact check is insufficient. Yeah, I think still we need to have them. We should expose them wherever we find them. There's something some very smart lady said during the Cold War. But yeah, this pre-bunking idea, this information against disinformation and building resilience by knowledge. Because why I'm so resilient? Because I was in Ukraine, I was in many Eastern European countries. I know about the history, something at least. So I was quite resilient, but other people not at all. And if they are from the academic sphere, and if they are, for instance, historians, then my tolerance is not so high, because then I think they are somehow ideological subverted.
You turned off pretty quickly, but um
I clicked wrongly. Yeah, so it's your turn.
okay. Um, I agree with that notion, but again, in that case shows the importance to differentiate between the kinds of disinformation. For example, we need to understand when we talk about fakes and when we talk about narratives, which is something more general. I mean, the narrative about Euromaidan being basically allegedly crafted by the United States as the so-called color revolution. This narrative has been really downplayed. However, there was a number of fakes of different longevity to support the narrative. And as you mentioned, there are some really long-standing disinformation campaigns, but there are also most of them now are really having a pretty short span, I might say. Nevertheless, the thing is that media literacy is super important for all these things. And I really believe that pre-bunking actually can improve the situation because I think they should go together. I mean, if there would be no debunking, it also doesn't make any sense because I mean, there's so much nuance sometimes to debunking, and there's so much layers to that. However, also debunking without pre-bunking also is not that effective. I think they should go along and they should be together in that regard. They should be exercised together. I think schools should have some media literacy courses, definitely. I think universities should have a huge focus on media literacy because this is the integral part of the modern security system. And actually, for example, I personally thought that I will never be working with issues or topics related to security matters, but actually due to disinformation work, I actually got into security related matters and security related work. And this shows how hybrid warfare, as we call it, became very prominent nowadays. Furthermore, people should remember, especially those who are working in the military field, in the security complex, that Russia understood why paying billions for weapons and waiting for weapons if you could kill people just by orchestrated fakes. Because a huge portion of this disinformation is really that harmful to people. Like, for example, this is especially relevant to disinformation on the temporary occupied territories. When, for example, sometimes Russian propaganda is creating fakes about evacuation from some territories. And those people fall for that because of the circumstances and because of the situation in general. Like it's so difficult to monitor information when you are under the constant threat and constant fire alarm and under constant challenge. But at the same time, they are going out for this evacuation and they become a really easy target for Russian armed forces, unfortunately, and they are dying because of that. So, I mean, we really have to be considerate about that. That, I mean, sometimes these fakes can be really absurd and really ridiculous and really hysterical at some points. And there are many instances when it's made for the show, for the bragging, but there is quite quite large portion of this disinformation that is really, really, really harmful for people. And we should remember about that.
Thank you very much for these very, I think, suitable last words for today. For today, I think we need to talk again. We are still, I think we're still on the tip of the iceberg, but at least we are there. Some people refuse to go even there, and this is a problem. And I always say the problem is that we don't even share the analysis that we have a problem. And it's very interesting to talk to you, receive all the insights, and looking forward for some future specifics and some updates. And if you want to know more about Artur, I will give some links. I will put some links in the description of the video where you can find him, where you can contact him. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone. And thanks, Dietmar, for inviting me. Feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to make yourself acknowledgeable with my work and, of course, with Dietmar's work too. Hope to talk to you again. Also, in that instance, we talk outside of these formats quite regularly, but I hope we will get the opportunity to do something like that again.